Bertrand Russell's The Value of Philosophy. The reading you have from Bertrand Russell is comes from the three chapters of his book, The Problems of Philosophy. So in the early 1900s, Bertrand Russell wrote a basically intro to philosophy book where he wanted to give students or provide students with an understanding of what it is philosophers grapple with, what problems they're trying to solve. So in the course of that, he does offer at times his own explanation, ways of sort of answering those problems or solving those problems. But by and large, his book was a way of introducing students to the things that we're going to be looking at throughout the course. So in this case, we're talking about epistemology, of what knowledge is, what we know, how do we know that we know, and so forth. So Russell acts as a nice overview of all of the sort of questions that we're going to be dealing with. And so that's why you'll notice that this is sort of out of order, that there are philosophers clearly that came before Russell, both in our book and just, historically, chronologically. But I think this gives a good overview where you can see what is it we're actually grappling with? What are the problems that we're trying to solve? So the first sort of problem we're going to talk about is the distinction between appearance and reality. So I think all of us have had experiences where what it is that what appears to us to be the case isn't actually what is the case. So, for example, if you've ever had a very high fever where your perception of the world seems to be skewed, right? The fever has caused you delirious. You're seeing things that aren't actually there, or everything looks just a little bit off. Similarly, if you're riding in a car, driving in a car, and you see it's a hot day and there's what appears to be water on the road, that mirage, right, that we say we call it, in fact, a mirage because on the one hand, it appears to us as there's water, but we know in reality there's no water there. So there is this distinction between appearance and reality. And the question is, how do we know that what appears to us to be the case is actually the case? The next part we'll look at will be the existence of matter. So if we assume that there's something underlying our appearances, that there is some reality, something there independent of us, matter, then how can we establish that it's actually there, right? Because again, we're having a trouble already knowing whether what it is we perceive is actually the case. So chapter 2 is talking about how to sort of substantiate that there's something there, that matter exists. Now, if we're successful at establishing the existence of matter, then we now might ask the question, well, what's the nature of that matter? Can we know anything about that matter? So it's one thing to say, I know that there's something there underlying my experiences. There's some independent existing reality. But then the question is, well, can I really know anything about it past the experiences, right? Just what it appears to me. Can I know the thing in and of itself? In other words, can I know what's actually there? So this is just meant to be a nice overview of a lot of what we're going to be seeing in the work of the philosophers that we're going to be looking at. So starting with this sort of appearance and reality, I want to start with the sort of fundamental question that Russell poses. That's also a question that we find the other philosophers asking. Is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable person, could doubt it? So we're looking for certainty in our knowledge, and that's what epistemology, it's this, this sort of study of knowledge, or what is knowledge. Can I be certain that the things that I perceive, the things that I think I know, I actually do know? So this is the question. How do I know these things with certainty? And this is something you'll see, particularly with Descartes. If you have not read Descartes yet, Descartes' concerned about this notion of, do I have clear and distinct ideas? Is there things that I'm certain, there's something I can't doubt, that this is actually the case, that what appears to me to be the case is actually the case? So starts with, I think Russell does, it's nice way to start, is with the table example. So I look at a table, and imagine you're sitting in front of a table. I happen to be sitting at a desk right now talking. It's very similar to the look in the table. But imagine the table in the picture here is something you're standing in front of. And you're looking at this table. And I say, describe the table. You might say, well, table's rectangular. It's got very straight lines. Kind of looks arts and crafts kind of table. It's got light and dark brown color to it. The stain of the table. Might say the table's solid. And you might look at it. Now, it might be a little bit different depending on your perspective. So, you might be looking at it from the side or from down below. But you might say, okay, I see the table. I might ask you, do you see a table? Do you see? Oh, yeah, of course I see the table. And then I say, okay, well, is that what the table actually looks like? And we might say, well, is your everyday experience of this table correct? And what someone like Russell and Descartes and others might say is it's probably wrong, or it's very likely to be wrong. And you say, well, how could that table, my experience of that table, be wrong? And I say, well, here, let's imagine you're standing in front of this table, and I just asked you to describe it with, so your naked senses kind of thing. I say, okay, if I brought a magnifying glass and put it in front of that table, would the table look the same? Now, you might say, well, yeah, it looks pretty much the same, although you might say, well, now I see the wood grain a little more. So when I'm describing it with just the naked eye, it says, well, it appears to have a little grain texture to it, color's still there, but now the grain is more pronounced. Now I see, oh, there's actually a lot more to the grain. And I can see that when you put it under a magnifying glass, more so than even just touching it and seeing it with the naked eye. I would say, okay, so now I say, well, all right, let's say I put the table under a microscope. Well, now it's different. So just a regular microscope, you might say, well, the table still kind of looks brown, but now I notice there's all kinds of microorganisms on this thing, right? I'm seeing all things through the microscope. It's like, and we all know, if you've seen one of those science documentaries, that, there's microorganisms that are crawling all over us and objects and things, and it's, it sort of freaks you out if you really think about it too much. But ultimately, if it's under a microscope, you see the tables now, the ridges in the table, the textures are actually more pronounced. They look much deeper, thicker, and you see these organisms on there. And I say, well, is that what the table really looks like? Is the way it looks under the microscope? Or is it the table really look like what it does under a magnifying glass? Or does the table really look what we see with the naked eye? So it turns out, now I've got three different kinds of views of what the table actually looks like. And I may say, well, let's take it a step further. Let's go to an electron microscope. And now we do an electron microscope, and suddenly the color is gone. The table doesn't have a color anymore, but it has these deep valleys and almost mountain looking. And there's even more microorganisms on here. And it looks much, much different. If we got actually down to the subatomic level of that table, it turns out, and we may not think about this, but it turns out that atoms and solid objects aren't actually solid. They're mainly space. All right, so you have these atoms, and they're more like clouds, right? We always have this picture from school, like, oh, there's the nucleus with the protons and neutrons, and the electrons floating around like little, sort of like planets orbiting a sun or something like that. Well, that's not actually what they look like. They're more like a gaseous cloud made up mainly of space. So when I put my hand on the table, when I say, if you feel the table, are you actually feeling the table? Well, no, it's the forces in the atoms being repelled by the forces in the atoms in the table, from your hand to the table. So it turns out you're not even really touching the table so much as it's mostly space. And it's just the forces repelling each other, the forces in the atoms in your hand being repelled by the forces in the table. So is that what the table looks like? Is it mainly space? Which is the real table? Right? That's the question. And so your perspective, whether you're viewing it with the naked eye or a magnifying glass or a microscope or an electron microscope or whatever, is going to change the perspective. So what's the real table? What does the table actually look like? And then if that's the case, if it turns out that I can't be sure that the table I'm seeing is exactly that table, where is the real table? Or what is the real table? All right, so there's another way of looking at this too. When you look at a table, and I look at that table in the picture here, so referring to the picture right in front, and I look and say, oh, it's dark brown and light brown and that, and I say, imagine that in my head, anytime I see the color brown, it appears red. What I mean by that is whenever I see the color brown, what I experience is the sensation of seeing red. But it turns out I'm completely consistent. If you showed me, oh, there's a red ball over there, and you pointed at that and you say, what color is that? I'm going to say red. But what if or I'm going to say brown. And say, what if my experience is always red in my head? You say, oh, look at that tree. See that tree with that deep, dark colored bark? And I might say, oh, you mean the one with the dark brown? And you're like, yeah, that one. But what if it turns out that all I'm experiencing is red? And you'd never know because it's completely consistent. How do you know that your experience of the color brown is the same as my experience of the color brown? That's where we get sort of this disconnect, right? So we have a number of different ways, different perspectives we could take with this table, one of which being just the difference between our unaided eye and using those other devices. And now that draws into question what the table actually looks like. But there's also the question of what my mind brings to the experience, right? Is it possible that my mind looks at that table differently and sort of registers red where you register brown? Your experience is that it's very shades of brown. Me, it's very shades of red. But we never know because we're consistent in our language. So this is the appearance versus reality, what things seem to be versus what they actually are, is the philosophic problem. All right, this is a philosophical problem. How do I know that what things appear to me to be are actually what they are? So then that, of course, draws the question I've already mentioned, what or where is the real table? Is there a real table at all? So there's some philosophers who say, no, this is just an idea in our head, right? These are just ideas in our head. So in one sense, if you think about it, we are always experiencing ideas and not things in and of themselves, the actual thing. Even you, if we were sitting in a classroom together and I look at you, what is it I'm looking at? Well, I can't fit you in my head any more than I could fit a whole table in my head. What happens? Light bounces off the table. The photons from that light hit the cones and rods in my eye, and then my mind, those impulses, go to my brain, and my brain reconstructs from that data an image of the table in my head. So actually, we only experience images of each other. We don't actually experience anyone else as they actually are, any object as it actually is. It's only the mental representation of that image that we actually experience. And when we think about it that way, it really brings into question, well, am I really seeing the thing as it actually looks, as it actually is? Because my brain is actually an active component in my experiences of the world. But that then raises questions, right? Well, how much is my brain interacting? And notice we have no problem making the case that, well, sometimes when we're sick or there's a mirage or the conditions are right, that we see things that aren't actually there. Well, if that's the case, then we already know that our mind can be mistaken, right? The way in which it puts together pieces of our experience can be different. So in one sense, we are always looking at things from an image. We're always looking at things as a mental representation and not the actual thing. Now, we can look further at these sorts of distinctions when we're talking about our sense data, right? So there is a difference, as you see here, between sense data and sensation. And we can make this distinction. It's an important one to keep in mind, especially as we go on to talk about what is underlying the stuff out there. So as Russell notes, there is sense data is the things immediately known in sensation. In other words, when I look at the table, there's certain data that seem to come to me, right? And one is the color, for example. So we see color, we sound. If I were to touch the table, so if I, give a little knock and you feel the solidity of the table, I could make a sound, that's caused by the vibration. You say, oh, now I perceive there's data, there's sound data. There might be smell. I mean, that's kind of weird. Maybe the coffee cup on my table, I'm smelling the coffee that I have. And there's a solidity, right? The table itself. I put my hand on the table and there seems to be something sending, impulses to my brain saying, this is solid. That cup of coffee on the table has a particular smell. If I hit the table, there's a sound associated with that. So there's sound data. But notice that this is actually very different from the experience of those things, right? So there's a difference between sense data and the sensation or the experience of that data. Now, if this isn't quite clear, let me explain. When I see light, I know that there's a light. So let's say I turn the light bulb on. Light from that bulb goes to my eyes. It sends electric signals or little impulses to my brain. That transferring of impulses is different than my actually experiencing the light. So you can see here in this little graphic here, oh, there's a bright light. So my sensation is, oh, that hurts my eyes, right? I'm seeing the light and I'm experiencing that sense data. Now that's separate. My experience of it is actually separate from the data itself. So for example, some people who are more sensitive to light than others, right? So when I have my phone, I know that my smartphone, my brightness is usually down at least to 50% or so, sometimes even lower. Whereas my wife and daughter keep theirs, and even my son, they keep theirs up at 75, 80%. It's really bright. And when I look at theirs, it almost hurts my eyes. Now notice we're both experiencing the same sense data, right? It's the same, the light, whether it's 70% or 50%, whatever the other is experiencing, the data is the same. But the experience of the data is actually different. Right? And the same thing goes with sound or smell or touch. It's one thing to say I have an impulse of touch, and another thing to experiencing falling down, right? So the image there. So there is a distinction to be made between sensation and sense data. And we know that these two things are not the same thing. So this sort of further complicates the picture, although it does help us, right? It does say that if we're going to establish the existence of an independent reality that we know, that we get knowledge from, it's helpful to know that, well, there is something. There's underlying data that seems to be independent of us. And then there's also the way we experience the data as it comes to us. And there's going to be a question of what is the connection between those two things? How do those two things correspond with each other? How accurate is one and the other? Again, going to the fundamental question, the notion of appearance versus reality. What is the thing in itself, the thing that's there that's causing the data? And then how is it I perceive, or what is it I'm perceiving when that data is out there, right? And hitting my senses in some way. Now, this then raises the question, what is the relationship between physical objects, not objections, and sense data? All right, what's the relation between physical objects and data? So again, we go back to the table example. There's the idea of mind and what you're perceiving, and the idea of matter as there being something out there. And what we're still questioning is, well, what is that thing? Is there something out there that's independent of my experience of it? And when I do experience it, what is the relationship between the physical thing that I'm experiencing and my perception of the physical thing, right? What's in my head, the idea in my head. So this is kind of freaky at times when you really think about it, that, all of our interactions really are interactions of ideas. Even the sound of my voice is your ears taking that data, putting it back together into something, like the sentence, the sound of my voice. And as you're looking at the screen in front of you, you're seeing something that your mind is putting back together in a certain way. And there's a sense in which I don't know if you're seeing exactly what it is. So my very bad artwork here, as you can see, table's not so bad, I guess. But, philosopher, not art major. But you look at that and you go, okay, well, that kind of gets the point across. But are you seeing exactly what I'm seeing when I look at that little image? Is that actually doing the same thing? So going back, the first sort of part was, well, we're making a distinction, an important one that other philosophers as we go along will be making as well. What is this connection between appearance and reality? What's the connection between what we perceive to be the case and what is the case? What's the connection between sense data, the sensations that come to us, the data or the information that comes to us, and then our experience of those things, the sensation of those things? Now, if we recognize that there seems to be a distinction between appearance and reality, and we think there's something underlying that experience, right? That there's data, it's coming to me from something, and if we assume it's not me necessarily, then what we want to do is establish this existence of matter. And so as we see here, Russell says, well, the next question then is there any such thing as matter, right? Can I now say, I've made a distinction between mind and something external to mind, but is there something underlying that external, right? Is there something out there? And so he says, one thing we can be sure of is that sensation is not in doubt, the existence of sensation. So even someone like Descartes, as you'll read if you have not already, Descartes even recognized, look, I have an experience of an external world. I have an experience of stuff around me. So Descartes, at the beginning of his meditations, is sitting there in his seat, and he's got his, he's sitting there, he's got his candle burning, and he's thinking about the world around him, and he's saying, can I know anything with certainty? And he goes, well, I do know that I'm sensing something, that I have some sensation. In other words, a thing going on in your mind, right? So we want to keep that very straight. Sense data on the one hand, versus our experience of something on the other, right? And what's that connection we're looking for? But Descartes even says, oh, I've got this feeling that I'm sitting in a chair and I see the light. So I'm having sensation. That's not in doubt. The question is there something underlying that sensation, right? Is there some matter underneath it? So he applies his method of doubt to this question. Descartes was one that says, well, look, even though I have these experiences, these mental experiences, how do I know they're actually there? And so his Descartes starts with this idea, what if it's the case that there's some evil demon deceiving me? That really it's not the case that, I can question. So for example, he actually starts, before he even gets to that, he starts with, I look at the world around me. How do I know I'm not dreaming? How do I know this is not just a really vivid dream? And that the way things appear to me are really not the way they are. He says, well, if I can think the physical stuff around me is just a dream, then immediately I can't take it as certain knowledge, right? Because now I have to make sure I'm not dreaming, that this is actually real. So he starts with that, and he eventually goes to an evil demon hypothesis where he questions everything. Could everything he thinks is the case, that his mind accepts as true, is not actually true, that he's being deceived in some way? So we'll see that when we get to Descartes. His answer is, if I can doubt everything, but then find something sort of foundational to build certainty on, right? Is there some starting point that I can go from that can show that, oh yes, all of these things that I experience in sensation are actually correspond to a reality, an independent reality. Now, Russell, as I mentioned, offers his own sort of explanation to some of these questions. Even though he's presenting these as problems of philosophy, he's also sort of giving a nod towards his own answer. And he says, look, there is this sort of question about the relation between sense data and matter. And he thinks that there's a connection that makes it very, or at least extremely probable, that sense data does correspond to something. So he says, look, there is a sense in which we have a private world and a public world. A private world that's private to each individual. In other words, we have our thoughts and our ideas and our perceptions. We're all in our head. And Russell's saying, well, why isn't that all of reality, right? Why aren't we walking around as these little individual worlds unto themselves? And he says, there's a good reason to think that not all of our experience is private. That not everything that we perceive is actually just private. And he says, why? He says, well, here's a very simple example. So you see the image here of Niagara Falls. He says different people have similar, but not exactly the same experience of the same phenomena. So, for example, if you've never been to Niagara Falls, highly recommend it. Take the trip. It's an amazing experience. What you're seeing here is the view from the Canadian side of the falls, the American, looking over onto the American falls. If I go to Niagara Falls one weekend and I stand at a specific spot and I view the falls, I say, what do you see? Well, I see the water and I see color and massive amounts of water. It's really overwhelming at times when you look at it. It's just amazing to watch. And then you go there and I say, here, go stand here. And you go there and you stand approximately in the same position that I was, in the same spot on the Canadian side, and you look at the falls. And it turns out that both of us are going to give a very, very similar description of what we perceive. All right. Now, it might be slightly different. It won't be exactly the same. So, for example, you might not stand in exactly the same spot. You're not exactly the same height. Your vision might be better or worse than mine. Maybe you're a little colorblind, so the colors that you see are going to be a little bit off. But at its core, the experience you have is going to be extremely similar to mine. There's going to be similar shapes and the things that I describe. Well, there's a number of ways we could actually account for that. But the most probable seems to be, well, there's an independent existing thing out there, right? There's Niagara Falls. There are these big falls with massive amounts of water. And that seems to account for the fact that even though we're having slightly different experiences, that our experiences are similar but not identical, that we're still describing essentially the same thing. So how do we account for that? Well, as Russell notes, he says, it is the fact that different people have similar sense data and that one person in a given place at different times has similar sense data, which makes us suppose that over and above the sense data, there is a permanent public object which underlies or causes the sense data of various people at various times. So, very complicated way of saying that, oh yeah, we're seeing the same thing. that there's a thing there that we're both looking at and we're both seeing, that something exists there. Now, I want to be very clear, even though this is the case, and even though intuitively this works for us, that these are intuitions, that there is something there. I mean, normally most of us go through our lives with the assumption that we're experiencing an objective reality out there, something independent of ourselves. It is logically possible that everything is a dream that we create. And while it's logically possible, Russell notes, there's no good reason to assume it. Right? So it's quite possible that maybe something crazy like the world in my head is I'm the only thing that exists and you're just a fiction in it. And when you go to Niagara Falls, all I'm doing is creating this world in my head where you're saying the same thing that I experienced. And the reason you're being able to say that is because it's all coming from the same being, right? I'm the only person that exists, a sort of solipsism or something. I guess that's logically possible, that each of us are the only people that exist. Of course, if that's the case, it's kind of weird that we're actually talking or that you're learning anything from someone else, because it would essentially be learning from yourself. And there's things you know that you don't know that you then learn. Again, all of this might be a logical possibility that you could have created some world like this, but there's probably not a good reason to assume that. And he actually mentions the principle of simplicity, or Occam's razor. And what Occam's razor says is that the simplest explanation, all things considered, is probably the correct one. Now, that's a really simplified version of Occam's razor. Occam's razor actually says that we shouldn't multiply things beyond what's necessary to explain a particular phenomenon, basically. So in other words, Occam's razor doesn't mean the explanation will necessarily be simple. It's just that if we have a choice between two ways of explaining something, the one that requires the least amount of assumptions is probably the correct one. So there's any number of examples of this, right? So we could argue the Niagara Falls example is one that I've mentioned, where it could be Niagara Falls is completely in my mind, and that the reason you see Niagara Falls is because you don't actually exist, and therefore it turns out I'm only living in this world of my own, even though everything around me seems to indicate otherwise. Right. It's also possible to say, well, we actually don't see anything because if we go with Descartes, as you'll read, Descartes posits at one point this idea of an evil demon. And it turns out that this evil demon is implanting all these ideas in me. And so everything that I take to be true is not really true. But there's this being that's actually causing me to think all these things. So nothing that I actually think or experience is actually real. It's all something given to me by some external being. Now, again, the question is the explanation that there is an external world that exists independently of me, and that's where I get my ideas, and that in fact we all share this external public world? Or is it that there's things that we experience, we have ideas, but those ideas are based on a being that we can't prove exists or doesn't exist, but is somehow influencing us, even though we have no way of knowing that they're actually influencing us? Well, which one seems like a simpler explanation? It seems like when you have to posit the existence of something else that further complicates the explanation, that's probably not the right account. And so Russell here is basically saying that Occam's razor just tells me that, look, because of the number of people who've all experienced the same thing I have at different times, have all had similar experiences, odds are the simple explanation is, oh, there is actually something existing out there. There's matter. There are things outside of myself that we're all experiencing. Now, that sort of view, right, we've now got that view that there are things outside myself, Russell refers to as a sort of coherence approach. And what that means is that when we look at things that we know, when we claim to know something, a lot of times one way of establishing that what we're claiming is true is by saying that there is this sort of web of beliefs and ideas that all string together in a coherent manner. So it's instinctive beliefs which cohere with our other beliefs are stronger than those that don't. So it's possible that there's the evil demon giving me all of my ideas. But it turns out that when we have all these beliefs about the external world and the way the world behaves on a regular basis, and the fact that every morning when I get up and I go downstairs, I see my French press coffee maker, and there's my kitchen, and there's my dog, and that coheres with my instinctive belief the things external to me are actually there and they don't seem to disappear and all that sort of thing. I don't have to posit some other explanation, that there's some being that's causing me to think these things. So when you take our instinctive beliefs about the world and you couple those with other sort of beliefs that we form along the way, we start to come up with this sort of coherence approach. Say, well, it's unlikely that all of these things would point to one explanation. So there's no one thing that tells me there's an external world. It's not just my observation of the world. It's not just that I see something or hear something, but it's not only do I see it and I hear it, but other people see it and other people hear it, and there's a regularity, and there's other things that I put all together and say, oh, okay, now I can say that I actually know that this is there, that there is matter, there is an underlying reality. So this is what we would call a coherence approach, that when you sort of take all these things, our scientific theories, along with our observations, along with measurements, along with our intuitions about the world, and there we have an explanation for, or at least a justification for believing in the existence of matter. Now, as I mentioned, there's a third part to this sort of puzzle, right? So we start with appearance and reality. We say, well, we know there's a disconnect between appearance and reality, that we're not always sure that what we see is actually what's actually there. We recognize there's a difference between our sense data versus our sensation of that data, right? So seeing a color is different than the sense data of the photons hitting my eye, right? Those sort of things. But the sensation of seeing color, my subjective experience, those are different. So you say, okay, well, there's appearance and then reality. How can we know that there's an underlying reality? Well, we go to the existence of matter. So we've shown here that it seems reasonable, even if it's not 100%, even if we're not 100% certain that matter exists, we're pretty sure matter exists, that there's something objective underlying our experiences. So again, remember, Russell isn't claiming it's a 100% certainty, but he's saying the probability is, and if we use sort of Occam's razor and we look at this sort of coherence approach where all of these things all seem to indicate that there's matter, he says we're fairly safe in assuming there is something underlying everything, matter. Now, can we know anything about that something that we're talking about, right? So if we're now looking at the nature of matter, if we want to know, well, okay, well, what does that matter? What are the characteristics of that matter? Because notice back in chapter 1, we're saying, well, appearance and reality don't always sort of go together, right? So Russell asks, essentially here, what is the nature of the objects that persist independently of my perception of it? So we're going back to, let's go back to our table example. What is it that's actually there? You know, what's the nature of that thing? What are its characteristics? Because again, the appearance doesn't necessarily tell me what that is. Now you notice here at this point by chapter 3, we're not necessarily doubting the existence of matter. We say, yeah, there's something there. There's a thing there. There's objects there. The question is, can we be sure about what it is we know about those things? And this is what Russell explores in this chapter, right? So he says matter and space, when we're talking about things like matter and space, that they're essential. Is essential. Those concepts are essential to science. It's essential to science that matter is in space. In other words, it's not just in my head. All right, so there's the real space, what he calls real space, the public space, and then there's the apparent space, the private. So he thinks that science requires that there be a public space. Now, this may be an assumption in some ways, based on that sort of coherence, right? We say, well, look, it's not just in my head. And if it's not just in my head, then there must be a space, a non-mental space, where this stuff exists, right? And that leads to the question here, well, what is the connection between the public and the private space? So this almost goes back to the first question, the appearance and reality. But it is the case that he says, look, science depends on us actually acknowledging a public space. If it weren't the case, then we couldn't sort of agree on scientific rules. So, right, so if I wake up in the morning and say, look, there's no public reality. It's all about my private reality. And I get up in the morning and say, I really don't want to walk down the stairs. I think I'm going to open the window and just float down. Well, that's kind of ridiculous because I know I'm going to fall and break a leg or worse. But notice the idea that I can say, no, I can't just open the window and walk out is not because I could think really, really hard and believe, no, you can do that. And no matter how hard I think about it, there is this, or apparently is this public space, which is going to behave in ways independent of how I think about it. But he still wants to know what's the connection. How do we connect these private and public spaces? What's the connection between the two? And we have some idea from what we've already covered that, that these public spaces and the objects in those public spaces somehow affect us, right? They affect our senses. Now, the question is, do we know anything about the characteristic of those things that are affecting our senses? And for this, we look at physical objects, and we say physical objects cause our sense data. He says, so we can sort of come to the conclusion, we've come to the conclusion that yes, there is something called sensation, that our experience of the external world is different than the data that feeds us, but there are these physical objects that cause our sense data. And then that public data corresponds in some way to our mental reality, right? So when I look outside and I see the sun is shining outside and I see the tree on the front lawn and I see a car go by, that those objects, those things are causing my senses to see something. And in my head, I'm constructing a representation of those things so that my private perception corresponds in some rough way to the public space outside of me. Now, he wants to note that there is never a perfect correspondence between the two. So he gives the thunder and lightning example, which I think is an interesting one. We know that thunder comes from lightning, is caused by the lightning. So when you see lightning strikes, but the thunder is actually created at the moment the lightning actually strikes, right? Once there's this electrical discharge, it's that discharge which causes the thunder. But notice there's always a lag between what we see and what we hear. So the reality is thunder and lightning are simultaneous. Our perception of the world is that lightning always precedes thunder. Well, it doesn't, right? If you were just to go on the observation, on your physical observation of lightning and thunder, you would do, and maybe you've done this before, right? People say, well, wait for the lightning. So the other night there was a lightning, there was rain, and there was, at the end of it, there was sort of a mini lightning storm where there's just lightning with some thunder. And if you do, you see the lightning and then you count, right? 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. And they say, oh, it's 3 miles away. I know the lightning's 3 miles away because the thunder took 3 seconds to reach. Now, why is it? Well, we know that the light travels faster than sound, and that I see the light before I hear the sound, because the sound is always lagging a little bit. But what that also means is I'm always seeing things a little bit in the past. In other words, I'm never directly experiencing a phenomena. There's always a tiny, even if it's a millisecond delay between what I'm perceiving. We, in essence, live in the past. We perceive in the past. So when that lightning strikes, if I could see and hear them simultaneously, that would be one thing. But even the time it takes for that light to hit my eyes and for my brain to process that and to form an image, even if that's infinitesimally small amount of time, notice that it's not exactly in the present. It's always a little bit behind. So physical objects do cause our sense data, but they're not exactly like it, right? We're always looking a little bit in the past. And the sun is another good example. So it turns out the light from our sun takes approximately 6-7 minutes or something like that to reach Earth. So what we're actually seeing is the past, right? The same thing with stars. The light from stars we're not seeing it instantaneously. We're actually seeing light, some cases can be millions or billions of years ago before that light actually came to us, because it took that long to travel. So if the sun blew up right now, if I didn't know the sun went supernova, and I'm looking outside and I see the sun, it turns out what I'm doing is looking in the past, because the sun is already gone. The sun is blown up, and it will be 6 or 7 minutes before I'm going to see the sun going supernova, because there's going to be a lag. So we actually are all, in essence, living in this past, because our senses are very much the physical objects that cause our sense data. There are physical objects that cause it, and there's a similarity, but it's always just a little bit off, right? There's always just a little bit of lag, a little bit of difference. And when you sort of add into that we are all contributors to this by our mind actually reconstructing from the data the image or the sound or whatever it is that we're experiencing, then we know our mind is an active participant. So it's not purely the physical object that we're perceiving, because it's the physical object that causes the sense data, but the sense data itself is sort of molded and formed by our mind. And so it's possible our mind just doesn't do it perfectly, right? That there's things that it misses. Maybe even, for example, our sight. Maybe if we had finer grained sight, or if we had sight that could see, ultraviolet or infrared, that the things that we perceive would actually look much different than it is when we're only looking at the visible spectrum that our eyes can perceive, right? So his point here is just that the nature of matter is going to be a little more difficult to discern. So we know it's there, we know it's causing things, but it just might be a little bit off, right? Where maybe we're not exactly seeing exactly what we think we're seeing. But there is a definite correspondence between these two spaces, right? The public does influence the private, even if it's always a little bit in the past, a little bit off. But it's close enough, I think, to do sort of practical work. So if we're all good pragmatists about this, we say, yes, it's true. And notice this actually helps us when we're talking about science or perception of the world. So you might say, well, what good is this? How does this help me at all? Well, what it might do is make you reconsider certain observed phenomenon, right? So if you're in the sciences, and we can imagine a time when people thought thunder and lightning were two separate things, right? And they're saying, well, look, there's this lightning thing, and there's this other event called thunder. And since the two never happen simultaneously, one could argue, well, my senses tell me that there's a phenomenon called lightning and a phenomenon called thunder. But if we recognize, once we learn that light and sound travel at different speeds, and once we recognize this, we say, wait a minute, if that's the case, it turns out that we always seem to hear thunder after lightning. So we've got a causal connection that seems to be there in the public space. And well, wait a minute, if one causes the other, then these are actually going on simultaneously. As soon as the lightning strikes, there's the thunder is formed, the sound waves are formed. So it turns out, oh, well, these are actually two things that go together, which you might not have always associated as the two things going together. So I think it's helpful for us to think about the limitations of our senses and how our senses are affected by this sort of delay, what we perceive. So that, I think, is a good introduction to all the various things you're going to read throughout this chapter. So the question of what is it that we see? How does the things that appear to us, what are they like in reality? What's the connection between objects in the external world, assuming that they exist, with our perception of those things? If matter does exist, if you're not an idealist and believe that everything is just ideas and that when you walk out of the room, things disappear, if you're not that type, if you don't hold those sort of beliefs, that if you think there's an existing stuff, then what's the nature of that stuff? What's it actually like? Again, noting the other issues that we have between appearance and reality. And how much can we trust our senses, and what is the connection between these? So these are both interesting philosophic questions, but they also have implications for things like science and our observation of things in the world, that we might want to keep these in mind as we're evaluating various phenomenon, right? So Russell himself was very interested in science and noting that the public space, this connection between the public and private space, is an important thing to understand what that relationship is, not just for philosophers, but even for scientists. So that's the introduction. I hope that helps clear things up as you go on to Descartes and the other readings from this chapter. Once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.